This woman felt good and secure about her job, which is why she was so confused when she was fired out of nowhere. She was ordered to pick up the things from her desk and leave. But this would lead her to discover something incredible that would make her turn pale. Woman gets fired unexpectedly, stunned by what she finds in her desk. After receiving her diploma, Rebecca immediately applied for jobs in the city where she grew up. Due to her excellent education, she managed to land a job at the city hall as an accountant, and the years flew by. The pay was good, and her employers seemed happy with her, but then she suddenly received an unexpected call from her boss's assistant requesting she come by his office immediately. This was highly unusual. People usually got called when something was wrong, but Rebecca knew she was a stellar employee, so what could this be about? She shrugged. There was only one way to find out. Maybe she would get another pay raise, she thought hopefully as she knocked on the door and entered the office. But Rebecca quickly discovered no such thing was in order. The moment she sat across from her boss, he told her she was fired. Effective immediately, he added. Rebecca couldn't believe what she heard. When she recovered from the initial shock, Rebecca finally found her words. What do you mean? Why? I thought everyone was happy with my work ethic and performance, she asked for an explanation. But her boss didn't give her a clear answer, eventually saying she was the victim of budget cuts. Budget cuts? She worked in the financial department and hadn't seen any budget cuts. But before she could ask further questions, her boss instructed the security to escort her out of the building. This is ridiculous. What did I do? She grumbled as she gathered her belongings from her workplace, her colleagues watching in confusion. Once Rebecca gathered everything in a box, the security guards escorted her out, denying her a chance to say goodbye to her colleagues. But right before she exited the corridor, one of her colleagues suddenly caught up with her, saying she would be missed and moving in for a hug. Rebecca raised her eyebrows. The woman who caught up with her was a colleague from a different department who she didn't know that well, so she thought it was kind of strange that she was the one who came after her. This is nonsense, they can't do this, the woman said as she hugged her. But then Rebecca noticed something. The moment the two women were embraced, Rebecca saw her colleague sneakily put something in the box she was holding. Rebecca immediately understood why the woman had gone in for the hug, as it ensured the security guards couldn't see the exchange. Rebecca stared at her colleague, who winked and gestured to stay silent. Rebecca was taken off guard and wanted to know what was going on, but before she could say anything, security broke the two women apart and led the accountant out of the building. As Rebecca followed them, her mind began racing. Why had Janine, if Rebecca remembered her colleague's name correctly, acted so sneakily? What could she have given her? Even though Rebecca noticed Janine sneakily put something in her box, she hadn't registered what exactly was placed between her personal belongings. She had been so taken aback by her colleague's sudden appearance and weird behavior that she was just glad to have caught movement at all. The questions were gnawing at her, and Rebecca wanted answers, but she had just been kicked out of the building, and the security guards were still watching her. Maybe this isn't the best place to be right now, she mumbled, deciding to investigate at home. And she would soon discover that it was a good decision. Once Rebecca arrived home, she hurriedly emptied the box on the table. There were some pictures, pens and paper, and old notebooks, but all these things she had put in. She felt around in the box and noticed two more things, and when she took them out, a frown appeared on her face. Firstly, there was a yellow envelope, which she recognized from the city hall. These were the types of envelopes they would store printed documents in. Besides the envelope, there was a USB drive. Rebecca stared at the two items on the table before her. Why did Janine give her these? Rebecca let out a frustrated sigh. Every time she tried to get answers, more questions popped up, but maybe these items would tell her what was going on. She decided to begin with the envelope. As expected, it held a printed document. However, as she read the file, her eyes widened quickly. The document was filled with bank transactions, but not just any transactions. The sums were significant and ended up in offshore accounts. It immediately raised some red flags for the experienced accountant and also greatly confused her. Why did Janine give her this? What did she have to do with it? Then she saw it. The files bore the City Hall's mark, indicating that the transaction was related to the City Hall's finances. But she didn't recognize any of the bank accounts or remember seeing anything like this file, which was strange as she checked every transaction the City Hall made. What was this, and where did it come from? The surprising information in the file only confused Rebecca even more and left her with mixed feelings. The further she dove into the situation, the more concerned she became, but she also became more curious about where it would lead. Her gaze fell upon the USB. This had to give her some answers. Rebecca dashed toward her desk to grab her laptop and insert the USB drive. It took a few seconds for the files to load onto her computer, and when she opened the drive, she saw it was filled with videos. Rebecca immediately recognized the different rooms and hallways of the City Hall. What was all this? She randomly opened a few videos and watched it for a bit. It didn't take long for Rebecca to notice a pattern in all of them. There was one thing that stood out, one thing that connected every video together. All of them were recordings of her boss meeting with people. But as she watched multiple videos, Rebecca noticed something else, too. There were actually only 3 different people her boss met with. They wore expensive suits and seemed important, and when Rebecca looked closely, she could see they wore the same badge. What did that mean? Why was this footage saved? Who were these people? Rebecca leaned forward and noticed she was on the edge of her seat. Her mind was filled with unanswered questions, and she was becoming increasingly frustrated. What was she looking at? Why did her colleague give her this? Then her heart jumped as she realized something. Could this have something to do with her sudden dismissal? With newfound energy, Rebecca delved deeper into the documents, trying to find answers. She tried to recall the last few years at her job as much as possible. Has she ever seen any of these people or bank accounts? But her efforts remained futile. I don't understand, she sighed angrily, but then. Rebecca was ripped from her thoughts when the doorbell suddenly rang. She walked to the door and opened it. Her body froze in place as she stared at Janine. How did she know where she lived? What was she doing here? Rebecca didn't know what to say, but her colleague didn't wait for her to. Without asking or hesitation, Janine walked past Rebecca and into her home. Rebecca was overwhelmed by emotions. At first, she was confused, but anger quickly replaced that. Her anger caused her to regain control of her body. She slammed the door shut and turned toward her colleague, ready to confront her about everything. But Rebecca was surprised to see Janine pace around anxiously in the living room. The accountant frowned for a moment but immediately shook her head. There was no time to waste. What are you doing here? She demanded, barging into the room. She wanted answers, and she felt Janine could give them to her. Janine was startled by the volume and tone of Rebecca's voice and looked up at her. The colleague opened her mouth but turned her gaze toward the floor before saying anything. I'm sorry. This wasn't meant to happen. It's all my fault. I panicked. I didn't know what to do, she rambled. Deep lines appeared on Rebecca's face as she let Janine's words sink in. Was she the reason why she was fired? What did she do? Rebecca felt her blood boil. What's going on? What do you mean? Answer me, now, she demanded. Janine looked nervous and answered in a small voice. I can explain, but I can't tell you here. I have to show you. You have to come with me. The room fell silent as Rebecca stared at Janine. Was she serious? The accountant took a few deep breaths to calm herself down. She needed answers, and if this was the way, she had to do it. Rebecca got in her colleague's car and was curious to see where they were going. But before she could ask, Janine started talking. Her voice sounded steady, and her nervousness seemed to have faded. However, that didn't make what she said less shocking because she revealed she was indeed the reason Rebecca was fired. Rebecca felt the anger come up again, but Janine was finally talking, so she managed to withhold her fury for now. I had to download something only accountants could access, so I used your computer. They must have found out, Janine said. Rebecca quickly connected the dots in her head, which only confused her. Did Janine find those bank statements and videos on her computer? Why had she never seen them before? And why was she fired for it? What did you need those files for? And what is so special about them that I lost my job? Rebecca asked, her voice now drenched in puzzlement. However, her colleague didn't answer those questions anymore, as it appeared they had reached their destination. Rebecca looked out of the car window and noticed they had stopped at some sort of community center. Without saying anything, Janine exited the car and walked toward the building. Rebecca followed close behind. What were they doing here? When they entered the building, Rebecca could hear the murmurs of a crowd. Janine continued to lead the way, and eventually, they reached a big room filled with many people. The murmurs stopped when they spotted Janine, and Rebecca's colleague was bombarded with questions. Any news? Is it almost done? Is it fixed? Rebecca heard. Rebecca was taken aback by the situation. This was the last thing she had expected Janine to take her to, but it also intrigued her. Who were all these people? Janine went to the front and gestured for silence. And when she started to speak, Rebecca couldn't believe what she had to say. You're all gathered here because all of you are harmed by the same company, and the city doesn't do anything about it. Even worse, the city is helping the company do it, Janine said, causing the crowd to erupt. Yes, I found proof that City Hall knows about the problem and just lets it happen. Rebecca's interest was piqued, and she was curious to see where this was going. Janine explained that her brother had complained about the water quality. But when all of your complaints about it arrived at City Hall, I had to start an investigation, she said, explaining that every complaint came from the same part of the city. As I promised you, I would try to find the reason for the sudden change in water quality, and I finally found it, Janine told the crowd. She discovered that a local company was dumping toxic waste in the lake. It pollutes the surrounding area's water, and the problem will only grow bigger and bigger. But worst of all is that the City Hall knows about it but doesn't act, Janine continued. She discovered that the higher-ups received large amounts of hush money, but to get the final proof, she needed information hidden away in a data log only accessible by accountants. Rebecca frowned when she heard that. I managed to get it, but I don't know how to connect the bank accounts to the City Hall or the company, Janine sighed. Worried voices filled the room as the crowd realized their problem wouldn't be solved. Rebecca is speechless and can't believe the reason behind the files and Janine's weird behavior. And then the realization struck. Rebecca was fired because her boss thought she was onto him. A wave of frustration and anger hit her as it felt very undeserved, but a thought struck her immediately, and a smile appeared on her face. She just thought of the perfect way to get her revenge. Janine had told everyone her plan couldn't succeed because she lacked the knowledge to connect the proof to the City Hall, but that was precisely the type of expertise she had. I can help, Rebecca said as she suddenly stood up. The room fell silent, and everyone looked at her. But there is one problem. In order for her to solve the final piece of the puzzle and connect all the pieces of evidence Janine had gathered together, she needed access to a computer at the City Hall. Since she had just been fired, that was something she couldn't do anymore, but Janine could help her with that. Since Janine still worked at the City Hall, she could help Rebecca get access. They discussed their plan and enacted it the next day. Rebecca would come to the City Hall during lunch break when the offices would be empty. During that time, she could access Janine's computer and collect the final proof. Now that Rebecca knew what the bank statements were about, she had access to the internal database and could trace the money. It went through multiple offshore accounts and eventually ended up in her boss's account. All the funds originated from the same local company. This has to be enough, Janine said hopefully. The women immediately leave for the police station and explain the situation. The police are surprised to hear the story and take a look at the evidence Janine and Rebecca gathered. It didn't take long for them to realize this was a serious cause, and they started their own investigation. Thanks to Janine's detailed investigation, the police reached the same conclusion pretty quickly. The water quality in certain parts of the city was far below standard and a serious hazard to the citizens. The cause of it all was, as Janine had discovered, a local facility was illegally dumping its waste. Police set up a large-scale operation to seize production at the facility and ensure the waste is handled correctly. City Hall is confronted with a major water quality scandal and forced to take action to improve the situation immediately. Rebecca, Janine, and the citizens were happy with the actions, but things didn't end there. Bosses at City Hall, including Rebecca's boss, were fired immediately and tried for taking the hush money. A huge restructuring followed, and Rebecca was offered her old position back with a significant pay raise as compensation. Knowing the reason behind her dismissal was false, and the remaining people were not at fault, she agreed immediately. Rebecca and Janine kept in touch and kept up to date with the citizens of the areas affected by water pollution. They were happy to see that the city took the situation very seriously and noticed significant improvements quite quickly. All in all, Rebecca's and Janine's teamwork ensured the safety of many households.